My name is Gordon Coombs, and I am a former investigator with the Boulder District Attorney's Office. Being objective and being true to the evidence is the most critical piece of an investigation.
It's easy to talk about objectivity, especially in terms of this case, and being true to the evidence, and in this case there's especially a lot of evidence, often bizarre evidence. But how do we actually need to think about evidence? In this analysis, I want you to imagine you taking a college course in criminology, a college course in investigative techniques. And although we'll be dealing with a very exotic fragment from the Ramsey case, yes, evidence from the Ramsey case, I want you to pretend this isn't the Ramsey case. And it's not about JONBENET. It's not about suspects that we know about. It's not about who you think did it. We want to make it about evidence. In other words, we want to be as scientific about this as we can be. And so we are going to get to that quite soon. We're going to go through the various theories one by one, and you'll get a sense of what mine is. But for right now, throw all of that stuff out, and let's just do one simple thing. Follow the evidence.
One thing. Just one thing.
That's great, but what's the one thing?
That's what you gotta figure out.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. By the way, if you're liking the format of this particular video, let me know in the comments and we'll do so again. It does take a little bit of extra work, but if you appreciate it, we'll repeat the whole process. Now, I want to talk about an exercise in thinking. You know, if you want to become a crack investigator, you need to learn to think in a particular way. And I'm going to show you how in this episode, as we try to reconcile two very different areas, a wood fragment found inside JONBENET during the autopsy, and then also Melody Stanton, the across the street neighbor, her witness statement about hearing a scream. We are talking essentially about synthesis, about putting the building blocks together of information and then developing an integrated structure that holds together. In the comments, I see horrendous amounts of fragmented thinking. You know, when we talk about a witness hearing a child scream that lasted 3 to 5 seconds and was cut off, that's a heck of a lot of detail. Then someone makes the leap to think it was Patsy screaming.
When you're investigating a case, you don't try and fit the evidence into what your theory is. That's when mistakes happen.
So what we want to do is follow the evidence first. Let's gather the evidence. Let's find out what it is. Be curious, put it all together before we close our minds. In other words, let's begin with an open mind.
You felt it your entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad.
Did you know there's a splinter in this case, and it is quite maddening as well? And did you know that John Ramsey has just given an interview? I think it's going to be on Anderson 360 tonight. Look out for that on CNN, about his recent meeting with Boulder PD. But John's opinion of the case is that it's a DNA case. And he believes that that is the key to answering or to finding out who killed JONBENET. I actually think that this splinter is a key, perhaps even a better key, a stronger key to solving this case than the potentially inconclusive DNA sample that John wants to make or break this case. Imagine if they test that DNA and it comes out inconclusive. And are you saying this is the key, the only key to solving this case? And then nothing comes out of that testing. It's not a given that you're going to get some kind of profile at the end of it. You might not. And so how can you make this entire case contingent on an unknown that might even take you nowhere. And so I want you to keep an open mind, and in terms of that, think about this evidence, this splinter, as potentially very, very important information. And by the way, it does actually take us into the DNA narrative. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, if you're feeling impatient for analysis, for updates on this case, you can always head to Patreon. I'm always putting content up there on the $3 tier, so head to patreon.com/TCRS. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please hit the thanks button and let's get started. So we're going to be looking at 8 questions about the splinter. But let's take a step back before we go to those 8 questions. Did you even know that there's a splinter in the JonBenet Ramsey case? We're not talking about pieces of whittled wood. We're not talking about wood fragments. We're talking about a splinter that was found inside JonBenet's body. If you think about it, that is even more bizarre than the ransom note. In fact, the ransom note, if you think about it, is a kind of inverted echo to the splinter. Let me explain myself. We have 2 very strange evidence artifacts, yin and yangs, opposites of one another. The one taking us inside JonBenet, literally, not just her body, but her mind, her feelings, her pain. Although microscopic, so small as to be virtually invisible, this splinter reveals an authentic fragment of what really happened to JonBenet. The other evidence artifact takes us outside, right? Not only outside JonBenet, but outside the house and apparently even outside America, to some obscure foreign faction that knows and cares about fat cats and about good southern common sense. This aspect is inauthentic, it's misleading, it's superficial, and takes us away from the truth of JonBenet and what really happened to her. Does that make sense? Well, now that we've laid out a canvas for our investigative mind map, now that we have the woods laid out before us, in a kind of virgin territory, now it's time to drill down into specificities. I want to do that, but without being too specific in this highly sensitive area. And that brings us to 8 questions about the splinter. Number 1, what is it? It appears in the very last paragraph of the very last page of the autopsy report. And the term the coroner uses is birefringent foreign material. The foreign material description, as well as the context of red blood cells, suggests that this fragment was microscopic in size. Now, if we quote from this excerpt, from the very last paragraph of the very last page of the autopsy report, it refers to the following. All of the sections contain vascular congestion and focal interstitial chronic inflammation. This is the part that's important. The smallest piece of tissue from the 7 o'clock position of the something wall contains epithelial erosion with underlying capillary congestion, seems to indicate some kind of injury. A small number of red blood cells is present on the eroded surface, as is birefringent foreign material. In sum, what we are dealing with is a fragment, a tiny fragment, which means whatever it is, it comes from something else. Number 2, what material? What is birefringent? The complicated answer is that it refers to a semi-transparent material that distorts light passing through it, such as cellophane, plastic, certain types of crystals, collagen. That's a biological substance found in cartilage, tendons, bones, corneas, which is tissue found in the eye. Also cotton fibers, that's a kind of plant fiber, and then even some proteins. Number 3, well, what can we assume it is? There are many possibilities. What kind of material are we talking about here? Well, I think there are 2 possibilities. Given the fiber evidence, we cannot discount the possibility that this foreign material was a cotton fiber that was wiped inside JonBenet as part of the cleanup and covering up operation. And yet the other cotton fibers were obviously cotton fibers and identified by color. This material appears to be different and not just colorless but translucent. We have to be very careful now, because if we misidentify this material, then we can ruin the whole symphony.
When one note is off, it eventually destroys the whole symphony, David.
In Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, Lawrence Schiller refers to this material colloquially as cellulose 12 times. In fact, the word Birefringent doesn't appear once, not a single time, in Schiller's definitive and very encyclopedic 832-page book on the Ramsey case. But in a contest between the statistical possibility of cotton fiber evidence, which we know was present, and other evidence which was also attached to the little girl, I'm willing to accept that the foreign material is more likely cellulose than cotton. Number 4, what is it most likely to be? So if it's cellulose from what? Right? Cellulose from where? Well, from wood. Cellulose is a polysaccharide or carbohydrate that makes up the cell walls of plants and algae. It is also the most abundant biopolymer on Earth. Number 5. Okay, so where does it come from? Possibly from the paintbrush, which we know was broken on two ends. And need I say, the paintbrush is made of wood. By the way, if you want to fashion a garrote, why use a dinky little stick, almost a twig? And why break the ends off of it? And if you think about it, if it's so easy to break the ends off, if you're trying to use this stick for the purposes that it appeared to be used for, why on earth would you use such a dinky little thing? A stick that could easily break. And again, like, why break the ends off of it? If you need it just for that purpose, why do that? Unless what you're fashioning isn't a garrote. And that is a very important question that we need to consider and develop a separate synthesis for. What is this stick and string thing? Why is it the way it is? And that might tell us who made it. Number 6, what does this mean? Well, one interpretation is that the paintbrush was inserted into JONBENET. The one end of the handle of the garrote was inserted into JONBENET. If so, this suggests one of several reasons why the stick thingy wasn't a garrote. It certainly wasn't made for one express purpose. That much appears to be clear. Number 7, are there other possibilities? The hand that fashioned the paintbrush probably assaulted JONBENET. In other words, the hand holding the paintbrush, the hand that broke the paintbrush, may have gotten cellulose fibers onto it in the process of breaking it. But it remains a kind of chicken and egg argument in a sense. I mean, whether it was a hand holding a stick or a hand that had held the stick, it's really just a matter of how much hand and how much stick rather than either or, at least in my opinion. Which brings up the question, was any evidence found on the paintbrush stick? Well, have a look at these excerpts from the Bode technology. That's the lab that dealt with a DNA investigation in March 2008. And look at point number 2, dealing with the paintbrush sample. 2S0702 were not processed at this time. So have they not tested it, or have they tested it and the results are secret? Why not test these items when they are so obvious, so apparently integral to the crime? Unless you know, or you don't want to know, what the evidence is going to be or where it's going to lead you. At a minimum, if the stick was used as part of the assault, surely JONBENET's DNA would be found in it, and you can at least have certainty on that aspect of the crime. And that brings us to number 8. Number 8, what insight can we synthesize from this? First of all, the paintbrush scenario suggests that this aspect of the attack on JONBENET occurred in the basement. There are several reasons to believe this is likely. The basement is a relatively secure space. It's a relatively out-of-the-way location, probably the most out-of-the-way location in the house. And then the proximity to the wine cellar and the train room and the basement window. And then the fact that the paint tote was found there as well. Now consider the following from Detective Steve Thomas's book, JONBENET, Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation, when we're thinking about where could this crime have happened in terms of other evidence. On page 37 he writes, in the far corner of the basement, just outside the small room where the body had lain, Detective Mike Everett discovered a half-dozen oil paintings on canvas and an artist's plastic tote box belonging to Patsy. In the tote was a broken brush splotched by paint. Splinters were on the floor beside the tote. It was a major find because the broken brush matched the fractured end of the multicolored stick used in the garrote. The detectives had found the source of part of the murder weapon and where it had been broken. Now, unless the crime didn't happen in the basement and the tote was transported to the basement like JONBENET, like the blanket, possibly even the knife from somewhere else, then, how do we explain this evidence? But the splinters are on the floor right next to it, next to the tote, which suggests that's where the garrote was made and that's where the essay happened, and that is where JONBENET died. Except one splinter is missing. The end of the paintbrush was never found. This again makes one wonder, if the splinter is somewhere else, is that where the crime happened? And you might think you are overthinking this aspect, but think about the ransom note not having any fingerprints on it and also not being picked up. The location of the ransom note is also quite hinky in this case. So back to this notion, the end of the paintbrush is never found. This again makes one wonder, if the splinter is somewhere else, is that where the crime happened? And if it happened somewhere else, where else might the tote have been lying around, if not the basement? Anything else? Well, this action, a stabbing action with a sharp stick into a sensitive area, couldn't that have triggered a scream? And wasn't it the blow to the head that cut off the scream? But how could someone be on the floor with a paintbrush causing a scream and seconds later standing over JONBENET with a bat, unless there were two perpetrators? Interestingly, in one of his earlier interviews, Burke speculated that his sister had been stabbed, and I think he's right. With a bit of license, with a piece of wood, although the stabber probably didn't anticipate this penetrative action being so painful for its recipient. Now, coming back to the idea of how to think about thinking, what strategy to use to investigate effectively, do you notice we aren't making absolute statements? We're asking questions at various layers and allowing those layers to address other questions and other evidence. When we do that, what are we doing? We are integrating evidence. We are gathering it and trying to reconcile it with itself. If it integrates into a cohesive whole, great, we might be dealing with reality. But then there's another section to this whole process. This can only be reality if this hypothesis integrates seamlessly with everything else. Only if that occurs is it truly cohesive. And so, is it? This is the thinking process we need to employ in order to find our way to the truth, including of our own lives. Is the way we think about one thing cohesive, coherent? Is there continuity and synchronicity with everything else? We can only answer these questions while mustering enormous quantities of self-awareness. In other words, we must know ourselves intimately and honestly in order to effectively synthesize what to do and how to live through complex situations in our lives. We do this not by thinking and behaving reactively or by being triggered by random fragments, but by being painfully conscious of connections, integrations, and how these are evolving as part of an interconnected process. So what we need to do is reconcile the splinters with the paint stick to find out who we are, and in this case, who our ace of diamonds is. Hello, my name's Nick. Welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. These are some of the books that I've written, and if you find my analysis worthwhile, if you're interested in true crime, if you're interested in some of those big cases, JONBENET Ramsey, Madeleine McCann, Amanda Knox, I've gone to a lot of those crime scenes. If you're interested in that sort of behind the scenes material from someone who, I also studied law, you might want to join my Patreon. You can have a look over here. This is the Patreon channel, True Crime Rocket Science. You can see there's quite a lot of content on there on the Ramseys, especially at the moment. So most of the content is on the $3 tier, so that's where most of it is, and then also on the $5 tier, or around about 10, 12 short audiobooks, and on the $10, did I say $5 tier? On the $5 tier, it's short audiobooks, and on the $10 tier, around about 10 to 12 longer audiobooks. So go and check it out. Thanks, guys.